Hi, I'm William Spaniel. Welcome back to the Strategy of Voting. This lecture is on preferences, self-interest, and selfishness. So remember in the introduction to this course, I talked about how essentially when you get down to it, voting is an expression of preference. And so before we can talk about how groups of individuals vote and have preferences, we first need to have a sensible understanding or a sensible model of how individuals have preference. And so that's what we're going to be covering in this unit. And this is the first lecture of the unit. And so in this lecture, we're going to be introducing preferences and also talk about how they relate to self-interest and selfishness. So to start things out, just think about outcomes in a very generic way. So on the screen right now, I am putting in front of you 5 different outcomes. I've labeled them very generically. They're just letters A, B, C, D, and E. These things could represent anything and everything, and we're not going to get into details because that will lose out on some generality. I'll actually get into a couple of examples just to illustrate an important point later, but we want to think about these things as generally as possible. We could have a world with even more outcomes, like, that many outcomes, but I'm going to keep it simple. And in fact, for this video, I really need to keep it as simple as humanly possible. And so I can actually get things down to just 2 outcomes, where we just have 2 outcomes, A and B. So what does that mean if you prefer an outcome? What happens, or what does it mean if you prefer A to B? Well, think of it this way. Suppose that you were the dictator of the world, and I, as your humble servant, came to you and said, "Oh, dear dictator, we have 2 outcomes or 2 options that we can implement. We can either implement option A or we can implement option B. And you're the dictator of the world, sir, so you get to choose, and whatever you choose is what I'll implement. So what would you like? Would you like me to implement A, or would you like me to implement B?" Well, you could tell me that you prefer A to B. And the way we do that is we just draw an arrow here. So if you prefer A to B, the way we illustrate that, and these graphical representations can be really useful once we get into a more complicated scenario with 3 outcomes or 5 outcomes or 18,000 outcomes. We draw an arrow going from A to B, so the arrow is pointing toward B, and this is the way we represent the fact that you prefer A to B. So if it's totally up to you, if it's your choice whether we implement A or B, then it's up to you. And if you're self-interest, if you say, hey, I like A better than I like B, then that's how we just illustrate that preference. That's all it means. And it could go the other way around, where if you prefer B to A, we just draw the arrow the other way. And so now the arrow is pointing toward A, and here you prefer B to A. Now, I mentioned self-interest there, and it's very important that when we're talking about individual preferences and we're talking about self-interest, because when you're the dictator of the world, you're determining what you want. So you're going to determine that based off of what you like. And if you like B to A, you prefer B to A. But that self-interest statement doesn't have a horribly negative connotation as you might think. So imagine that these 2 choices were A and B. Choice A is that I give you $20, and choice B is that I give everyone in the world a dollar bill because, somehow magically I've come across $6 billion. All right, well, if that's the case, if A is $20 for you, B is a dollar for everyone in the world, think about what you prefer. If you'd like, you can comment on the video and go ahead and write either A or B. And as it turns out, either one is fine for our model of preference. So you might think that it must be the case that if you're going with self-interest, then you must prefer A to B. But that's not what we mean. It could be the case that you have some sort of utility or some sort of value for being generous, for being benevolent. And so that's why you might like to give everyone in the world a dollar, even though it's not in your own personal financial interest to do that, because you'd want to take A and take $20 for yourself and essentially get 19 more than what you would get if you chose B. So either answer here is acceptable, and self-interest does not imply selfishness. It could or it could not. It depends upon how benevolent you are. If you're not very benevolent or you're not benevolent at all, then it's in your self-interest to choose A over B. But if you're benevolent, then it is in your self-interest to choose B over A. I can give you a more extreme example of this. Imagine we're talking about C and D instead, and C is I kill you versus D, which is I kill everyone in your family. Now, again, if you'd like, you can go ahead and comment with which one you would want to implement in this sort of situation, but I'm guessing most of you are going to choose C, and that's fine. Obviously, that's a very selfless act versus D, which is very selfish, and either one of these is fine despite that. When we talk about self-interest, it's just what you like. And the reason I really want to stress this is because you will often encounter very poorly informed critics of this sort of modeling of preference who tell you that when we talk about preference and choices, that we're really only looking at self-interested choices, and they implicitly mean that self-interest means selfishness. But that's not the case. Don't think that. There's nothing here that says that. In fact, everything here I've said so far is the opposite of that. When we talk about self-interest, it could be selfishness or it could be selflessness. It doesn't matter. All we need to know is what sort of choices you would want to implement. Would you want to implement A or would you want to implement B? That's all we need to know, and it doesn't matter whether A is actually beneficial to you versus B, or A actually harms you and B is good for you. Those don't matter. Either thing is acceptable. Now, the last thing to note here is that when I say you have to prefer A to B or B to A, that's not the only two things that could happen. There could be this third choice that you are indifferent between A and B, and the way we draw that is by having an arrow going both ways. So if you really just don't care about whether A is implemented versus B, then we say that you're indifferent between those two things, and we draw the arrows accordingly. And that's how we do that. Now, in the future, when we're talking about aggregating preferences among groups, we're going to mostly tuck this away underneath a rug, because indifference makes proving statements a lot more difficult. But I don't want you to think that I'm actually hiding anything from you. When we sort of ignore preferences, or rather indifference in this way, and we only assume that individuals have strict preferences, all of the results that we're going to be going through in the future are going to go through, and it's going to be fine if we introduced indifference. It's just that proving these sorts of statements when we allow for indifference becomes a lot more complicated, and it becomes, well, more difficult to prove, more time-consuming to prove, and it doesn't really teach us anything more that we don't already learn by just assuming that individuals have strict preferences about everything and no one is indifferent about anything. So we could have indifference, and that's how we would illustrate it, but we're going to mostly not have that in what we're going to be talking about later on. When we write preferences, we write it like this. So if you prefer A to B, then we'll write it A, P, B. If you prefer B to A, then we write that B, P, A. And if you're indifferent between A and B, then we have it as A, I, B, or B, I, A. Doesn't matter which one that you write. Those are the same thing. You'll see this come up every now and then, especially if you're reading books on the subject. So that's why I have this slide. We'll probably not be using this notation very frequently, but this is for your own knowledge and general interest that these things should be in your head somewhere. All right, the last thing that I want to talk about here is what we need to do to have sensible preferences. Oh, that's the wrong way. There we go. All right, so for individuals' preferences to make coherent sense, we're going to eventually have to introduce two axioms, and that's what we're going to be doing in the next two videos. In the next video, we're going to be talking about the completeness axiom, which basically requires that an individual have a stated preference for every possible contingency. And then the second axiom that we need to introduce is something called transitivity, which enforces an individual's preferences to make sense when we are looking at more than just two preferences at a time, or more than two options at a time. And so these are the next two videos. The next video will deal with the completeness axiom. The video after that will deal with the transitivity axiom. Hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you next time when we talk about completeness. Take care.